I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. The following episode is one I've been working on for quite a bit, featuring a guest that I highly admire, Jim Lobe of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He used to run the Lobe Log, and he is probably one of the foremost critical chroniclers of the neoconservative movement, how it came into power, its role in giving us the Iraq War, and what has happened to that movement since, especially with its fragmenting in the Trump era. This conversation was actually done in two recordings. I had to do a little editing to get the best portions of both recordings, and some of the answers may be rather in-depth. There's a lot of granular detail that Jim offers in this conversation. He originally came on to discuss the passing of Dick Cheney and how we should understand Cheney's legacy. We'll delve into that. We also get into how Dick Cheney wasn't himself a neoconservative, but rather a sort of Jacksonian figure when it came to American foreign policy, someone concerned primarily with U.S. power, regardless of morality. Whereas the neocons have a sort of moral philosophy, even if it's arguably cynical, to their thinking. We'll talk about how figures like Cheney and Rumsfeld came to work with neoconservatives and also evangelical Christians, and how this coalition became pivotal to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, especially under George W. Bush's presidency. All that and more on this fascinating conversation. Like I said, it gets very granular. Lots and lots of detail here, but I, myself, found it riveting because it really does give a clearer understanding, in my view, to the global war on terror and how it came about. Before we get to the conversation, though, I'd like to remind you that it is you, the listener, that makes this show possible by supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you're a $10 and above tier supporter on Patreon, you get a producer's credit shout out at the end of each and every edition of the show. If you have not heard your name shouted out, please contact me on Patreon through DM, or just contact me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com, and I will fix that. Sometimes I don't always get updates on the new subscribers, even though I usually get an email from Patreon. Sometimes it slips through the sometimes it slips through the cracks. Sorry, I'm a bit tongue-tied today. In any case, if you're at the $10 and above tier and haven't heard your name in the credits, contact me directly. Also, if you can, please support my one and only sponsor, Mike Swanson of wallstreetwindow.com. Other than you, the loyal listeners of Parallax Views, whom contribute to my Patreon page, Mike is my only sponsor, and I highly recommend his financial and trading newsletter, wallstreetwindow.com, where you can also, if you sign up for the newsletter, get a copy of his ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I've ever used. Highly recommend that. I've had listeners make return on investment from Mike's trading tips, so I highly recommend you check out wallstreetwindow.com. And with that being said, let's get to the conversation with Jim Lobe. Welcome back to Parallax Views. A guest that I'm very happy to have on. I think he's been on the show once or twice before. He's a big influence on my work. I've been reading him for a number of years now. I'm talking with Jim Lobe, a contributing editor to Responsible Statecraft, the online publication of the Quincy Institute. And also he served as chief of the Washington Bureau of Interpress Service from 1980 to 1985, and also from 1989 to 2015. And he's done some great coverage and sort of understanding and analyzing the history of the neoconservative movement and its influence on U.S. foreign policy. And we're going to be talking about Dick Cheney, who recently passed away. First, Jim, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm fine, thanks. It's very. I'm in Seattle, which is where I'm from, and we're in the middle of an atmospheric river.
Whoa. So, with regards to Dick Cheney, it's funny, when I told someone I was going to be doing an episode about Cheney, since he has passed away now, someone said, "Is it really that important to do, another episode on Dick Cheney? I mean, wasn't Iraq, 20 years ago? Isn't that ancient history?" And it kind of irked me because I feel like Cheney's legacy lives on and has cast a very long shadow, not just because of what I consider the atrocities of the Iraq War, but also because I think Cheney was a big supporter of the sort of unitary executive theory. And I think we have seen that theory play out with the Trump administration. But enough of me talking. What do you make of Dick Cheney's passing, and how important is it that we understand his legacy?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And although the Quincy Institute is very much focused on foreign policy, perhaps his most enduring legacy, and in some respects very destructive legacy, is championing the idea of a unitary executive. That is, an executive that more or less has almost complete authority to implement the laws of the United States in the way that the executive sees fit. And of course, we're dealing with that now. And as has been commented by mainstream media and others, it's very clear that Trump is taking the notion of the unitary executive to extremes that even Dick Cheney, I think, did not contemplate. But it was Cheney who, in many respects, set the precedent, gave a degree of legitimacy or reputability or credibility to this legal concept, which previously had not been discussed really, and recruited, not him personally necessary, but say one of his assistants, David Addington, recruited a number of lawyers who would into the Justice Department and Office of Legal Counsel to elaborate on and strengthen this notion of a unitary executive. And we're certainly suffering the consequences of that now. Of course, what the Supreme Court has to decide aspects of that doctrine, and it has not yet done so, although the initial suggestions by some of these rulings on the emergency docket are quite negative in terms of their support for the unitary executive. I don't know if you, I did go to law school, and I'm the member of a couple of bar associations, but I'm not sure that's what you wanted to talk about most. I think what we began with was his legacy in foreign policy.
Right.
And that too is very, very strong, um, resulting, well, I mean, his legacy goes back. He was a super hawk, or somebody that I refer to as a Machtpolitiker, way back in the 70s
Right.
when
People,
he worked
not to interrupt
for,
you, but I was going to say people often forget he was around during Nixon and Ford.
yeah, and very influential, particularly under Ford. And he and Don Rumsfeld and a group of people who came to be known as neoconservatives worked to derail Henry Kissinger's efforts at achieving a détente with the Soviet Union.
This was Team B, correct?
Well, Team B was part of the strategy
Okay.
of delegitimating détente, and we can go into that if you want. But um, of course, in terms of legacy, 30 years after his success in derailing détente, he was probably the biggest proponent of what became the global war on terror after 9/11 and the Iraq invasion. In fact, it was he who kind of launched the final push to get the public behind that invasion. I believe in the latter part of August in 2002, when he evoked for the first time the possibility of a mushroom cloud resulting if Saddam Hussein were not restrained or kept in his box, or however he put it. And he empowered, by virtue of his influence as vice president, with a relatively, well, quite inexperienced president in George W. Bush, he empowered other hawks, other Machtpolitikers, like John Bolton, for example, in the State Department, who was undermining Secretary of State Colin Powell as much as he possibly could. But he also empowered the whole neoconservative wing of the Washington establishment, the most important figure of which would be Richard Pearl, uh, by placing a lot of Pearl's colleagues and acolytes in key positions within the administration and also outside the administration in order to uh, build support, public and elite support for taking the war on terror into an invasion of Iraq and the consequences. And it's pretty clear that the Iraq invasion was a huge strategic disaster for the United States, the consequences of which we still live with.
If I could, I know we don't have to focus in on the unitary executive angle for a long period, but I did want to ask. Well, initially, I was going to ask what was Dick Cheney's worldview, but I think we can tie this into the unitary executive because maybe a way of getting into his worldview would be asking the question, why was he such a supporter of the unitary executive, and what does that say about his worldview when it comes to foreign policy?
Well, I mean, by his own admission and his own statements, it's very clear that he believed that the post-Vietnam, post-Watergate legislation passed by what was then a Democratic Congress to rein in um, the FBI, the CIA, and the president and other agencies that the president had a great deal of control over, that he thought that these were, disastrous for US power in the world. He believed that, I mean, if he were Shakespeare, he would say those encroachments by the legislative branch on executive power were unnatural in a way could not be justified because in such a stressful world order, with the United States, in his view, being constantly under attack of various forces during the Cold War, obviously communists after the China split, um, Soviet imperialism, uh, leftist movements in third world countries, and so on and so forth, that the president should be endowed with the power to act swiftly and without too much oversight, um, in order to ensure that U.S. national interests, how he defined them, could be furthered. He just felt that the legislative branch was out of control. And to some extent, I think he felt similarly about the judicial branch when they kept insisting on things like um, the Bill of Rights, like, police having to give Miranda warnings to suspected criminals. I think he thought essentially that the changes and reforms in America and in the American governance system in the late 60s and first half of the 70s were not good for the country. And that inspired having to roll back those reforms, I think became kind of his career's focus and ambition.
Where do you place him ideologically within the world of foreign policy discourse? What I mean by that is you have been very careful to say that Cheney himself was not a neocon. If anything, he was a neocon enabler. He enabled the neocons.
Mhm.
What makes him different from the neoconservatives, and how is he maybe different from other foreign policy heavyweights like, say, Zbigniew Brzezinski? What's the school of thought he really comes from?
Well, I don't know because I never took international relations in college or graduate school. Um, I mean, again, to me, he was a Machtpolitik, someone who believes that states should aspire to power. And you do that primarily through military power, although, he had a certain amount of confidence in soft power as well, which the current president seems to lack. Um, but military power ultimately, in his view, was the coin of the realm. And in that respect, he's not different from neoconservatives. But I think there are a range. Well, what I've argued in the past is that you had a coalition of Machtpolitikers and anti-communist, anti-Soviet in the 70s, led by Cheney and Rumsfeld, um, working with neoconservatives who at that time were the most important ones in many ways were based in the office of Senator Scoop Jackson from Washington State, who was the head of the Armed Services, the Senate Armed Services Committee, often referred to as the senator from Boeing. Within his office, he cultivated, well, I have called it his office a hatchery of neoconservatives, led by his longtime aide, Dorothy Fosdick, and kind of second in command was Richard Pearl. But other important neoconservatives either worked in his office or worked with the people in his office, among them Paul Wolfowitz. He did not work for Jackson directly, but collaborated with Pearl for a long time. Elliott Abrams, who was Assistant Secretary of State in a variety of positions as Assistant Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, and then reemerged. Well, he has a long history, and we can get more into him if you like. But He also had roles in the Trump administration as well, and the George W. Bush administration, where he was on the National Security Council as senior director for Middle East affairs, which made him very influential in the so-called global war on terror. Douglas Feith, who became Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, the number 3 position in the Pentagon under George W. Bush, worked as an intern in Jackson's office. Frank Gaffney of the Center for Security Policy, who became very influential in the Reagan administration as an ally of Richard Perle, fighting against various arms agreements with the Soviet Union under Gorbachev. He also worked in Jackson's office. And there were others who kind of circulated around the office, whose names don't occur to me just this instant.
But the important thing is that there's a sort of an alliance forming between like the Cheney and Rumsfeld Machtpolitik types on one hand, and then these neocons in Scoop Jackson's office.
Right. And Jackson was very anti-Soviet for a variety of reasons. And of course, I don't know if people remember, but the Jackson-Vanik Amendment still lives and is causing problems for Central Asian states. That was an attack on the Soviet Union. It was designed to put pressure on the Soviet Union to enable Soviet Jews to leave Soviet Union, mainly for Israel, some to the United States as well. But it was always, it was passed as a very hawkish step in, and very important in derailing détente. But similarly, Team B was largely constructed by, well, again, this coalition of Machtpolitikers and neoconservatives. And Team B is about their dissatisfaction with estimates by the Central Intelligence Agency as to the extent of and intent of the Soviet Union to wage a strategic conflict with the United States. And what it found that the CIA was way too dovish, way too conservative in assessing Soviet intentions, and that essentially the United States had to greatly increase the defense budget in preparation for what could very well be a nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union. It was kind of a crazy set of assumptions that were later, after the Soviet Union collapsed and people could get access to the archives, was more or less totally disproved, and that felt the CIA estimates were much closer to the truth than what Team B did. But the formation of Team B, which was made possible, again, by Cheney and Rumsfeld, with influence over Gerald Ford, who was then president, was a extremely serious blow, a fatal blow, one can argue, in gaining a SALT II agreement with the Soviet Union. So it also contributed very heavily, more heavily even, to the derailment of détente in the latter part of the 70s. So you have this coalition of two, and that coalition would again come together in the late 90s with the addition of the Christian right or the Zionist right, who more or less took their foreign policy cues from the neoconservatives, who were very pro-Israel. And then you have a coalition of Machtpolitikers led by Cheney and Rumsfeld and arguably John Bolton, combined with the neoconservatives, people like Perle, Wolfowitz, Feith, Abrams, all combining. and add to them the Christian right, which had more or less accepted the hardline neoconservative views about the importance of protecting Israel and even of creating a greater Israel. And that combination essentially assumes control of US policy in the Middle East in after 9/11 and retains control until arguably maybe 2006, although it started losing momentum a year earlier when it was clear that the Iraq War had not been won, that it was going to go on and on.
Out of curiosity, when it comes to Team B, I don't see many people reference that uh, sort of plot. I would call it like a sort of a threat inflation scheme. But I think it's an important story because I think we see echoes of it in the lead up to the Iraq War. Do you see parallels there?
Oh yeah, I mean definitely. Threat inflation is the pertinent phrase. I mean very much. If you're going to rally the country behind a major foreign policy initiative, you need to provide something that scares them and makes them feel they better attack now, or in the case of Soviet Union, arm up now as quickly as possible, um, rather than wait to see if the other party has peaceful intentions, in which you're not interested. But yes, definitely. I mean, neoconservatives in particular have been really expert in exactly what you're talking about, threat inflation. And they're very, very good at making arguments that scare people. Um, Much more convincing, I think, than the Machtpolitikers. Much more in terms of rhetoric and argument. I think they're generally much more sophisticated than other groups. I mean, I can't say that that is the case today because I think there have been huge splits in the neoconservative movement over Donald Trump. There are other issues that they are split over, but if we're talking about the period 1973 to 2011, anyway, um, they've been highly unified. They were highly unified, very good in messaging, very good at threat inflation.
If you could, um, this is a side sort of story because I know we're focused on Cheney, but I do want to talk about your coverage of the neoconservative movement that you've done over the years because I think you've actually gotten to the core of what neoconservatism is. Whereas a lot of people, I feel, throw around that term in a very vague way. Or they'll say, oh, they're just Israeli firsters, or they'll say, oh, it's just a Wilsonian project. I think you've pushed back on both those interpretations of neoconservatism. So, what is neoconservatism? I know you've written that article, Neoconservatism in a Nutshell, but maybe we could go over that a bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't have the article in front of me or an outline, so I may miss some things. My argument is there are hawks in U.S. foreign policy, and and they come from different sources. And the neoconservatives are a subset of hawks and have been a subset of hawks, but should not necessarily be mistaken for other factions that are hawkish, that make up the world of hawkism, I guess you could say. And my argument has been that what makes them unique is the fact that they initially come from the left, But more important is that they have a very, very strong emotional attachment to Israel. Um, and that Israel is, and Israel's protection and welfare is at the core of neoconservatism. It's certainly not everything, but it is what the most important uh, point that differentiates neoconservatives from other hawks. And it's no secret that most prominent neoconservatives have been Jewish, a pretty large majority, but not every neoconservative is Jewish. Um, there have been a number of non-Jewish neoconservatives, as well as many Jewish neoconservatives.
I
And
was going to say Jean Kilpatrick, I think, was one of the non-Jewish ones.
she
Yeah.
would be one, although she's kind of an interesting case because um, I she definitely was considered a neoconservative and could be considered a neoconservative up until the Iraq War. And then she did not necessarily think it was such a great thing. And I think a degree of realism started affecting her judgment. But the reason she was considered a neoconservative is that the platform which made her prominent in foreign policy debate was Commentary magazine, which was the home of neoconservative thought.
That was David Horowitz's rag, I think. Yeah.
Well, no, David Horowitz was Rampart's far left.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he became, well, an Islamophobe and a neoconservative,
Right.
very extreme on both sides. But no, it was Norman Podhoretz was the
Oh, yeah. I
editor.
got him mixed up.
Yeah. And Podhoretz's wife was also very, very influential um, in elaborating this. And a lot of conservatism comes out of a reaction to a number of events in the 1960s. And I don't know if you want to talk about that, but that also makes neoconservatism quite distinct from
Are you
other
open to getting
hawks.
into that a little bit?
Well, again, I wish I had my notes because I haven't talked about this stuff in a really long time. The the first the first thing there were a lot of things that were happening in the 1960s. 1960s are well known for a lot of things happening. Um, for one thing, you had the counterculture and the growth of the anti-war movement. And um, the the pros and cons of both were much discussed in the pages of commentary, which at that time was uh, published by the American Jewish Committee. And so it was a kind of internal debate within the Jewish community about how to react to counterculture, hippies, anti-war movement, the fact that youth was um, very much attracted to these things, which were seen by the people who became neoconservatives as somewhat dangerous. Although, again, I don't want to get into too much detail because you could talk a long time about this, and I don't have my notes with me.
I think the best way to put it is I think you quoted Irving Kristol at one point and how he used that phrase mugged by reality. And I guess there were Jewish public
Oh, that
intellectuals.
liberals were mugged by reality. Were
Right, yeah.
neoconservatives were liberals mugged by reality. Yes, that is true. That's how he defined it. Um, the anti-war movement made them nervous, curiously, because there were so many prominent young Jews who were so big in the anti-war movement that they were afraid it would provoke anti-Semitism. This is in the pages of Commentary magazine. But there was also worry that turning your back on Vietnam in the event of the anti-war movement could weaken U.S. support for Israel. So there were there were arguments about all of this. In 1967 was the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, sometimes referred to as the Six-Day War. And that really shook up the Jewish community because for the first time, the Jewish community in the United States felt that Israel really was in great danger. That's how they understood the war, number one. Number two, another impact or effect of that war was the emergence of a new concept about Jews. And again, I don't want to get into too much detail, especially in the absence of notes, but until that time, Jews were seen as the great victims and of Nazism in particular and fascism in Europe, and as kind of lambs who went to the slaughter. And there was a certain shame, I think, associated with what had taken place to the extent that people understood what had taken place in the 1960s. And you have to remember Holocaust consciousness, or to go back, in the 1950s, I think most Jews didn't talk about what happened during the Holocaust. But in the early 60s, Israel abducted Adolf Eichmann in Argentina. That came with a big trial in Israel of Eichmann, who was a major head of logistics for getting people to the concentration camps, essentially. And all this testimony came out that had kind of been repressed or forgotten, willingly or not. And suddenly you had like Hollywood blockbuster Judgment at Nuremberg. And this really had an impact on how Jews saw themselves before the 1967 war. I was a young Jew in Seattle at the time, and I know Judgment at Nuremberg had a huge impact on me and my sense of security, and also my sense of self as a Jewish person. And again, the general idea was that Jews went willingly like lambs to the slaughter and didn't put up resistance. Well, in 67, there's a whole new image as Jews as warriors, extremely good and effective warriors. And that fostered, I think, a much more, both the fact that Israel's existence seemed to have been threatened and that it was vulnerable, and the thought after the war that Jews can be strong, Jews can win wars, Jews are warriors, combined, I think, to help move a segment of the Jewish community, by no means a majority, toward become much more open to hawkish positions on foreign policy, especially when it came to protecting Israel. So the 67 war also started moving some Jews to the right, at least on foreign policy terms. I think a third thing that happened was the Black Power movement on university campuses, especially in the Northeast, especially. And this worked psychologically on many Jews in a number of ways. Jews were at the forefront of the civil rights movement, or at least they saw themselves at the forefront of the civil rights movement, which they saw as a multiracial movement for equal rights. But the Black Power movement was, to some extent, a repudiation of this idea of a multicultural front or multiracial front. And especially in big cities in the East Coast. The Black Power movement arose against slumlords, some of whom were Jewish. And there was a degree of anti-Semitism that it didn't underlay the Black Power movement, but it was partially present. But also, Black students started demanding things like Black studies. They demanded quotas for Blacks at universities, both for professors and for students. And this created a very strong reaction among some elements of the Jewish community who remembered that quotas were used by the Ivy League schools to prevent the admission of Jews for many, many decades prior to the 1960s, or even until the early 1960s. So quotas were like a bad word. And if you take somebody like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who, despite not being Jewish by any means, used commentary as a platform for spreading his ideas. He at one point wrote that you have to understand, if there are Black studies departments and there are quotas for Black professors and Black students, there are going to be fewer slots for Jewish professors and Jewish students. And he made that argument explicitly in opposition to Black Power or the Black Power movement. And I think also there was this sense that by many Blacks moving into a Black Power space, they were repudiating their previous comradeship with Jews, and there was a sense of betrayal about this. And some Jews, influential Jews, again, by no means a majority, began moving right on that front as well. It's a combination of all of these events that move a segment of the Jewish community and many people who identified intellectually or in other ways with the Jewish community to the right, to what Michael Harrington eventually called neoconservatives.
So it sounds like, I just wanted to emphasize, it sounds like there's these past historic traumatic events and also all these things that are happening in 67 that really lay the groundwork for neoconservatism.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And that create, in a sense, neoconservatives. And it's interesting because, I mean, again, as they felt alienated from their previously comrades who were Black in the Black Power movement, some became increasingly or more overtly kind of racist. And when you combine these things with what was going on in the United Nations, where the end of colonialism was clearly underway, there were all these countries that were declaring their independence and were taking on an identity that in some ways was kind of like Black Power. Like, we are the third world. We are third world countries, and we fight colonialism wherever it appears. And this all culminates partly in the 1973 war between the Egypt, Syria, and Israel, which really also reinforces this idea that Israel is very vulnerable and absolutely requires Western and especially US support. But the political repercussions, what with the Arab oil embargo that followed the 73 war, with the invitation to Arafat to come to the UN, where he brandishes, a revolver and an olive branch and says, you have to choose one or the other. And then the General Assembly resolution, which defines Zionism as a form of racism. all of this combined with what we've talked about before, especially the Black Power movement, moves again this minority of influential Jews to the right in opposition to the third world. And you get these depictions of the United Nations as just a bunch of clowns, but highly dangerous. And a lot of these attitudes become fixed and part of the neoconservative worldview. Especially disappointing to them was how Europe responded to Arafat and to this sense that the third world was that Europe kind of tried to identify more with third world aspirations and kind of was more sympathetic than Americans were to these aspirations, and that they were kind of, especially with the Arab oil embargo, that they were trying to appease these sentiments. And as indeed Europe was trying to, was really favored détente at the same time. And there was this notion that Europe is soft, Europe only cares about business. And so they seem to kind of sell out their ideals by making deals with these third world countries in order that they can get more energy. And they're deserting us, and they're deserting Israel. And so that there becomes this very strong anti-European component that enters into the worldview. And boy, that you can see that in spades after 9/11,
Right.
and European opposition to the Iraq War. We weren't going to have French fries anymore. It had to be freedom fries because the French are just so perfidious, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
If
I
I
think I've
could,
gone into too much detail. I apologize.
no, no, no. I think the details are important. I guess the two-pronged thing I wanted to hit on here was first, I think you've pointed out rightfully that for the most part, neocons talk about spreading democracy, but as Zbigniew Brzezinski would put it, really what they mean is destabilization, with maybe potentially the exception of Robert Kagan, who to me is
Mhm.
interesting because he seems like the one true believer to me.
Mhm.
I don't know if you want to comment on that at all, the sort of this idea that they're Wilsonian. I'm not
Yeah.
so sure that that's really true.
Well, I'm in the minority in viewing this, but I have always felt that the rhetoric that neoconservatives have used to say that they're all for democracy and democratic transformation in all of these problematic countries is not cannot really be taken seriously when you look at the movement as a whole and how it has supported autocrats virtually that are, as long as they're pro-US, virtually down the line. In part, this is Kirkpatrick in the 1980s, late 70s and early 80s, attacking the Carter administration for trying to spread democracy and respect for human rights and punishing countries that commit atrocious violations of human rights. And she says, this is no way to run a foreign policy. That's really much more where neoconservatism is. And as you point out, I mean, it was I who asked Brzezinski at a dinner, what do you make of the rhetoric of the pro-democracy rhetoric of the neoconservatives? How do you interpret that? Do you think it's sincere? And he replied, when I hear neoconservatives talk about democracy, I hear destabilization, not democracy. And again, the democratic standards, when they're applied, um, well, yeah, I mean that's the main point. It's become a cliche to say that uh, neoconservatives, or if you're on the right, neocons, always talk about democracy and how they promote and democracy promotion. And yes, they do always talk about it, but it's not where they really come down. And if forced to choose between a friendly authoritarian and democracy, they'll go with the friendly authoritarian virtually every time, Kagan being an exception. Now, I think Trump has created a lot of problems because just as Irving Kristol said, a neoconservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. There is a residual liberalism in neoconservatives, which they hope to preserve, at least at home. And when they feel threatened, and Trump makes them feel threatened, in part because I think they have sensed from 2015 onwards that Trump, if not an anti-Semite himself, would unleash anti-Semitic forces or make them more respectable or more mainstream. There was this sense that that was a serious possibility. And where do you go when you sense that and you're an American and you define yourself as an American? You tend to ally yourself with liberals and identify yourself as one, as a protection.
Right. I also, the second part of that was you've pushed back a little bit on this idea of neocons as that term that gets thrown around, Israeli firsters. And I think you have a lot of clarity on this because you pointed out that neocons, it's not they put Israeli first, they literally view Israeli and American exceptionalism as, and interests as essentially one and the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's rationalization because I don't think Israeli interests are consistent with American interests. They may coincide from time to time, but just the fact that they live in different regions does not mean automatically they cannot be the interest cannot be the same. And I think they rationalize by saying that issue by saying they don't see a difference between American and Israeli interests. I don't know that it's conscious rationalization or whether that the way their brain functions, it requires them to see the world that way. And I have no doubt that they do.
So we've talked a lot, Jim, about the sort of intellectual history of the neocons and also Cheney and Rumsfeld and this sort of idea of mocked politics. I think you've also said that it's sort of a Jacksonian politics. Do you want to delve into that and just how the forces of neoconservatism, that sort of Cheney-esque politics, and even Christian Zionism coalesce with each other under Bush?
Well, they started coalescing well before Bush. We've already discussed to some extent how the neoconservatives and the Machtpolitikers, or the Jacksonians in Walter Russell Mead's words, got together already in the 70s, and they'd been working together for quite a long time. I didn't previously, I didn't allude to the predecessors of what became the Project for the New American Century, in which both neocons and Machtpolitikers worked closely together. I mean, for example, in the 70s, there was the Committee on the Present Danger, which was the second iteration of the Committee on the Present Danger. There was one right after World War II that kind of ginned up the Soviet threat. So in the 70s, these two groups, these two ideological foreign policy groups, kind of got together and created the Committee on the Present Danger, which was all about the fear of the Soviet Union and exaggeration of the Soviet threat around the world, especially in the Third World, or what was called the Third World at the time. And that group consisted mainly of these two components, Jacksonians and neoconservatives. And then in the 80s, you had the formation of the Committee for the Free World, which was co-chaired, I should say, by Donald Rumsfeld and Midge Decter. Midge Decter was the wife of Norman Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary, and very, very influential in her own right. But you had that coalition as well. So meanwhile, like Cheney is in his off years is affiliated with the American Enterprise Institute, where Richard Pearl is kind of the dean of foreign policy studies. And he and Cheney had long had a close working relationship. I know Rumsfeld and Cheney wanted Pearl to become Deputy Secretary of Defense. Pearl had served in the Pentagon in international security affairs, a very important post during the Reagan administration, or during much of the Reagan administration. In any event, Cheney and Rumsfeld wanted Pearl to be Deputy Defense Secretary, but he declined, I think in part because he made, as a consultant, especially to arms manufacturers and various governments who were interested in buying U.S. arms, he made a lot of money, and he obviously enjoyed that. He has a house in France, or at that time anyway, he had a house in France, and he liked that life. And if he were to become a full-time government official, that would have compromised his ability to sustain that life. So essentially, they're very close, and that's demonstrated again by the successor to the Committee on the Present Danger and the Committee for the Free World, which is the Project for the New American Century. In 1996, Bill Kristol and Bob Kagan wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs called Toward a Neo-Reaganite Foreign Policy, which essentially put back on the table into public discussion the Wolfowitz paper. It called for American benevolent hegemony over the world. That was one of its great phrases, is benevolent hegemony that the U.S. should exercise. The following year, both men, Kristol and Kagan, created or founded the Project for the New American Century. And it revives essentially the Wolfowitz defense planning guidance, which was worked on by a number of people who would serve in very important positions in the incoming Bush administration as of 2001. So when Bush won, there was already a kind of foreign policy establishment that was available to staff the key positions, and that came from the Project for the New American Century, or PNAC. Now, I mean, it should be pointed out, PNAC's original signers in 1997 included Cheney, Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, who was to become Deputy Defense Secretary instead of Pearl, Elliott Abrams, who was famous in the Iran-Contra days, or infamous in Iran-Contra, and a guy named Scooter Libby, who became Cheney's right-hand man, essentially. He was Cheney's chief of staff and also national security advisor. So he was hugely influential. And he was a dyed-in-the-wool neoconservative associated with the Hudson Institute, which is also very neoconservative. So essentially, there was a national security structure in waiting in the Project for the New American Century, not only among its founders, but in a series of letters and statements that it published in the late 90s and 2000 before Bush took power, where they gained many more signatories on their various letters, and some of whom were then recruited into the administration. People like Douglas Feith, who was Undersecretary of Defense, and in that capacity oversaw the effort to collect bad intelligence, what ultimately turned out to be bad intelligence that would conclude that there were some connections between Saddam and Al-Qaeda, and as well as a possible nuclear weapons program, which was a distortion of what the larger intelligence community was finding.
Did you want to comment on the Securing the Realm and the PNAC documents, what you think is important about those, or?
Well, I think the main thing, okay, so Securing the Realm was put together by a group of 6 neoconservatives, including Richard Pearl. So this group included Pearl, Feith, and David Wormser, who would later work for Cheney in the White House, and before that for John Bolton in the State Department. They put together this paper when Netanyahu was elected for the first time as prime minister in 1996 of Israel. And the paper essentially made the argument that in order for Israel to escape from the confines of the Camp David Accords, which would logically lead to the creation of a Palestinian state alongside Israel, in order to get out of that, in order to make a clean break from that process, the important thing was to rearrange the balance of power in the Middle East so that Israel would be united with Jordan and Turkey, which the latter at that time was being led by the Turkish military, or was certainly the major force within the country, with which also the Israeli military had very close relations at that time. And the argument was the key to getting to this clean break from Camp David was to undermine Syria, to essentially achieve some form of regime change in Syria. And the way to achieve that was to gain regime change in Iraq, along with Jordan, and install a Hashemite member of the Hashemite ruling family in Jordan as the head of state of Iraq, which was a pipe dream. That was crazy. But the key was, in order to get Syria, to defang Syria, which was considered the most hostile and most dangerous state to Israel at that time, you went through Iraq. And at that same time, of course, they were this same group was close to an Iraqi named Ahmad Chalabi. And Ahmad Chalabi, whom I've called the greatest con of the 21st century, although now I think that position may be in some jeopardy. I'm not sure he was the greatest con. Chalabi headed something called the Iraqi National Congress, and he brought all kinds of supposed defectors, high-level defectors from Saddam's regime, to tell credulous Congress people and reporters, how Saddam was becoming extremely threatening, building nuclear weapons, and so on and so forth, and had ties to Al-Qaeda. And incidentally, Chalabi also met Cheney, and Cheney thought very, very highly of Chalabi. And so you already had a group coming into the Bush administration that was determined to achieve some form of regime change in Iraq in order to completely change the balance of power in the Middle East. So that's kind of the clean break scenario, if you will. And the paper is very clear about what the priority is for Israel to get out of Camp David. So you have kind of that's sitting there on the shelf once 9/11 happens. So that's kind of the regional ambition, is to achieve regime change in Iraq. And you'll remember on 9/11 itself, there were notes that were obtained from Rumsfeld's office, which said, this could be our opportunity to take out Saddam Hussein. Then there's a global ambition, which dates back to the end of the first Gulf War in 91, when the United States succeeded in ending Iraq's military occupation of Kuwait. Iraq had invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, and then the United States had this extremely successful military campaign to oust the Iraqis from Kuwait, called Desert Storm. At the end of that, there was an opportunity, it was believed, to oust Saddam Hussein. And there were people within the H.W. Bush administration who thought it would be a good opportunity to do it at that time. And that they included Wolfowitz, who was then Secretary of Defense for Policy in the Pentagon, and Cheney himself, although he later said publicly he didn't think it was a good idea. But there's a lot of documents that suggest he was in favor of that. But in that situation, the National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, Colin Powell, they all counseled against it. So the U.S. didn't try to overthrow Saddam. In the wake of that war, when Francis Fukuyama was declaring the end of history, and there was this belief that the U.S. was the unipolar, it was a unipolar world, U.S. totally dominant. Cheney had to prepare a defense planning guidance, which is fairly medium to long range guidance as to what U.S. military strategy should be in the coming decade or so. And he put Wolfowitz in charge of that task. And Wolfowitz, in turn, put a number of people in charge, including, for example, Scooter Libby and Khalilzad, Zalmay Khalilzad. These and a couple other people who would play major roles after 9/11 in the global war on terror and the invasion of Iraq. And that document called for, and they prepared this document, which was leaked to the Washington Post and eventually the New York Times. And the document was shocking in its ambition and said essentially that the United States should not permit the rise of any peer competitor on the Eurasian continent, and that the United States should be willing to take active measures to prevent any rival power from emerging on the Eurasian continent, especially if they were to develop nuclear weapons. We should be prepared to fight a preventive war against that country or that power, whatever it was. It said U.S. intervention in various conflicts around the world should be considered a, quote, constant fixture of the future foreign policy scene or in global affairs, that the United States should be seen as the ultimate guarantor of global peace and security. Essentially, the vision presented was one of hegemony, basically total dominance, at least as concerned the Eurasian landmass, which includes the Middle East. When this paper was leaked, it created enormous controversy and was heavily denounced by Democrats, including then Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Joseph Biden, who said this amounted to a Pax Americana and he wanted nothing to do with it. But nonetheless, in its final version, it was somewhat muted, but not very muted, and it essentially became the President George H.W. Bush administration's policy, or at least the Pentagon's policy under him. And it lay on the shelf during the 90s under Bill Clinton. And then when 9/11 happened, it was simply taken off the shelf. So you had a kind of regional plan that was based on the clean break paper of 1996. And you had this kind of global conception of what the US role should be, one of complete dominance. Uh, Also on the shelf when 9/11 takes place. And what you see immediately after 9/11 is that these plans begin to be implemented. Both the regional plan, which would definitely favor Israel, and because we're a close ally of Israel, would presumably very much favor us. But you also had this second vision being implemented. In fact, immediately afterward, Wolfowitz traveled all over the place in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, elsewhere, getting agreements that would put what some refer to as American military lily pads all around and within the Eurasian continent. And what you have in the Iraq War, which followed 9/11, was exactly the kind of demonstration that would be persuasive to any potential peer rival, that there was no point in questioning US power. If the United States military could go into and completely defeat a relatively well-off Middle Eastern power with great oil resources and change the regime overnight, it would have a demonstration effect that would discourage other powers from aspiring to ever take the United States on. And I think the Iraq War has to be seen in that context as a demonstration of American strength designed to intimidate other potential peer rivals into not challenging US power.
I just wanted to comment. It's kind of crazy looking back on this period uh, of the sort of Bush-Cheney regime and how significant the neocons were, because in the 90s there were neocons around and they were pushing a lot of crazy theories. I remember James Woolsey was a big proponent of that bogus Saddam
Yeah.
Hussein being involved in Oklahoma City. I think a lot of people found all of this kind of neoconservative conspiracy theory nonsense to be crazy back then. But then a few short years later, they're in power. Um, what do you think the main reasons for their being so influential by the time Bush gets in office are?
That's a very good question. Again, I think a lot of it has to do with the effectiveness of the echo chamber that they created over those many years, and in recruiting other people who are not necessarily new conservatives to their cause. I mean, that echo chamber was formidable, and it had operated and kind of gained gained weight, gained momentum over a period of time. But it included um, the Wall Street Journal's editorial pages. Irving Kristol had an in uh, at the eh, at the Wall Street Journal, and he could publish just about everything he wanted to have published in the Wall Street Journal, which is a very influential newspaper among elites and has been for quite some time. They were writing in the National Review. They were, of course, writing in Commentary magazine that affected or that was influential within the Jewish community. Um, and in the 90s, Bill Kristol, once referred to as Dan Quayle's brain back in the late 1980s and early 90s, was publishing or had begun the Weekly Standard with the support of Murdoch, among others. And that Weekly Standard grew in circulation among elites, particularly in Washington, D.C. And Cheney was a huge fan. He would actually pick up over 50 copies and distribute them around the White House. And then you have the growth of the influence of think tanks funded by far right or very pro-Israel um, uh, financiers and philanthropists. The American Enterprise Institute, the Hudson Institute, Middle East Forum, which really fanned the flames of Islamophobia throughout the 90s and well into the period of the global war on terror. You had the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, which had was pretty formidable, recruited a lot of U.S. military senior officers into their ranks over the years, did a lot of exchanges with IDF in Israel. Then, of course, there was the Heritage Foundation, which had which itself had a strong Jacksonian component, but also was quite sympathetic to neoconservative views, particularly regarding Israel. There were also columnists um, who were highly regarded and well placed. You had Charles Krauthammer at the Washington Post, who was the person who talked about the unipolar moment or coined the unipolar moment back in 92, 93, consistent with what Wolfowitz was essentially propounding at the Pentagon when he was Undersecretary for Policy. You had first Bill Kristol in the New York Times, and then much later, it was displaced by Bret Stephens, who previously wrote the Global View column at the Wall Street Journal. Stephens had been an editor at the Jerusalem Post, who has always worn his pro-Israeli politics on his sleeve. You had Max Boot at the LA Times, and I think as I remember, at the Washington Post too. These were voices that, didn't really represent these neocon commentators in particular. They weren't representative of the Jewish community as a whole, but they were given a lot of space and a lot of influence. And I think that, it helps explain the growth of their power from the late 70s or even mid 70s right through the 90s and right, on the threshold of the Bush administration and 9/11.
I wanted to ask, was I being unfair saying that I do feel like there were a lot of like kooky ideas that came out of neoconservative circles and very paranoid sort of, I mean, the whole Islamophobia industrial complex, as I call it.
Uh-huh.
Do you think am I being unfair saying that this media apparatus sort of allowed a sort of culture of anti-Islamic conspiracism amongst the neocons or popularized that?
Well, I mean, they were already pretty good at that. And I think to the degree that the more hardline thinkers in the neoconservative movement, their Manichaeanism, their belief that, life is a war between good and evil, and they're on the side of good, and American exceptionalism and Israeli exceptionalism, always, I think, tilted some of the fiercer elements toward a kind of, I don't know if paranoia is the word, but toward a conspiratorial mindset. And I mean, I don't think you were even alive, but back in the 70s, there was an attempted assassination of the Pope in the late 70s, shortly after John Paul II became Pope, I think. There was an assassination attempt, and some neocon writers, Claire Sterling, the most important with respect to that particular conspiracy, and Michael Ledeen, who was the second most important and a very close friend and colleague of Richard Pearl, you know, came up with this theory that it was the Russians who were behind the attempted assassination, and they kind of, wrote about and sensationalized this notion that somehow it was the Russians or the Soviets who had tried to kill the Pope. And the whole concept has been like totally debunked, but they fostered and they promoted this. It's the same. I mean, there's this kind of sensationalist notion. I was looking at there was a book co-written by Richard Pearl and David Frum in 2000, at the end of 2003. Yeah, I think it was the end of 2003, called An End to Evil, in which Pearl goes on a tirade. Well, I assume it sounds like Pearl rather than Frum, because there was nothing subtle about the rhetoric. And it was about, Sunnis, Shia, Arabs, Iranians, they're all out to kill us all, kind of. And yeah, I mean, I think if they themselves were not persuaded that conspiracies existed, they felt it was the use of conspiracies to marshal opinion behind them and to radicalize the debate in their favor is something they had no problem with.
I was going to say another one that comes to mind is Daniel Pipes.
Well, Pipes, yeah, in the Middle East Forum, for sure. Yeah, he promoted it. And uh, uh, David Horowitz, who had his own David Horowitz Freedom Center, who died in the last year, I believe, who started on the far left as an editor of Ramparts and ended and never stopped moving right.
Yeah, he
Also,
famously, I think, blamed the Black Panthers for the death of his one friend and like lost his mind.
well, it was his secretary, and yeah, and it was true that, I believe it was true that a member of the Black Panthers had murdered his secretary, but he had been in love with the Panthers prior to that existence, and he extolled them as kind of revolutionary heroes. And then once this happened, it was obviously a traumatic event, and he moved right and never stopped.
I want to get a
I
little
should note that he was a mentor to Stephen Miller.
right. Yes, I've done a whole show on that actually
There
with
is,
Jean Guerrero. Yeah.
yeah, there are through lines here, disturbing through lines.
I want to get to the contribution of Cheney and the neocons to Trump, but one thing we didn't talk about last time as much was the relationship of Christian Zionists and the sort of Christian right to all of this. Because it seems like there's three elements to the Bush administration. It's the Machtpolitiks, uh, the neocons, and Christian Zionists.
Yeah, to the global leading up to 9/11 and constituting the main components of the project for the new American century. Yes.
Can you comment on that at all? How relevant the Christian Zionists are to this?
Um, well, I think they're highly relevant because the neoconservatives by themselves have no substantial political constituency to speak of. That is, if it comes down to an election, there aren't many neoconservative candidates, um, and and one would not expect them. I mean, because people who are through and through neoconservatives are very, very few, and they require, in order to be considered politically potent, and putting aside the potency they have through the echo chamber that they've helped construct over now 50 years, they need a strong political constituency. And that political constituency since the late 1970s has been the Christian right, or the Christian Zionists. And because of their strength and number in the South and in the Midwest, and to some extent in the Southwest in particular, so that over a period of time, the Republican Party base became it consisted of many, many, many evangelical Christians, and that has provided the base that neoconservatives have depended on for their political influence, even though they rarely talk about it. And Christian Zionism is, the theology of Christian Zionism is kind of, well, is simply that Israel should be, greater Israel should be, is essentially a commandment from God. And theologically, the theory is that if Jews ingather, return to the Holy Land en masse, and rebuild the Temple of David, that will signal, well, and do a few other things like sacrifice a red heifer in the temple, that would bring about the return of Jesus Christ and redemption for the world, and bad tidings for people who didn't accept Jesus as their personal savior. So the neoconservatives back in the late 1970s, along with the Likud party in Israel, made a kind of devil's bargain whereby they would cultivate the Christian right and provide support, initially in the form of Jerry Falwell's first private jet, in return for support for Israeli expansionism, and the realization of greater Israel. And until recently, that has meant steadfast support from evangelical voters in the regions that we just talked about, for very pro-Israel policies conducted by the United States government.
So before we close out, in terms of the contributions of Cheney and the neocons to the current moment that we've been living in, I would say since 2015, 2016 with Trump, where do you think where do we see continuation? Where do we see rupture?
Well, and we were talking earlier about what was Cheney's legacy, and does Trump owe anything to Cheney? And I mean, aside from the theory of unitary executive, which Trump has taken to places that Cheney only imagined, with respect to well, let me back up on that. I don't find many ruptures, but I think, and I find many more continuities, but just to an extreme, compared to the neocons and Cheney when they were riding high in the first term of the W. Bush administration. On the domestic side, I would say the anti-woke rhetoric of this administration is very consistent with what the neoconservatives started, or helped start back already in the 1980s, which was about what they would denounce as politically correct or PC. That obviously over a period of time became the word woke. And Trump's anti-woke positions are perfectly consistent with that. The the anti-elite and anti-expert ethos of the Trump administration is very consistent with the rhetoric of very consistent, if somewhat exaggerated, of the rhetoric used by the neoconservatives in particular throughout this whole period, beginning again probably in the late 70s, but definitely by the late 80s. In fact, I was looking at an article I wrote in which I noted that the Weekly Standard, in a period of like 1 year leading up to the Iraq War, denounced elites, used the word elites in a way that was very pejorative, something on the order of 500 times in 1 year, and with Bill Kristol leading the pack in the number, something on the order nearly 100 times.
So
But
sort of they sort of have this oh, these liberal technocrats don't understand the threat and they're the problem. Yeah.
and make fun of them. I mean, and elite really became in their vocabulary, elite was highly pejorative and derogatory. And the same for for experts and even including scientists. For example, the Weekly Standard, and remember, Cheney distributed the Weekly Standard to everyone in the White House who he thought needed it. Um, they were climate deniers. They kept making fun of all this climate stuff. That was all these scientists who were coming out. They just said, no, it's not an issue. It's not an issue. I was thinking, even in terms of their focus on masculinity, if you look again at the Weekly Standard, they've featured uh, Victor Davis Hanson, who is really hung up on the weakness of men and how men needed to be men again. Or Harvey Mansfield, who was one of Kristol's mentors at Harvard, who was absolutely obsessed with manliness and what it meant. And I mean, that's absolutely consistent with what, essentially the Trump administration and MAGA is also seems to be quite obsessed with. Men need to be real men in a very traditional sort of way. And that also implies a degree of misogyny, which also came across in these essays like by Victor Davis Hanson. If men behaved in a way that was too soft, it showed that, that their manliness was clearly being neglected and was a danger to the republic. As you pointed out just, a few minutes ago, Islamophobia, and which easily translates into xenophobia, which I think is pretty much a staple of MAGA, of the MAGA movement uh, for quite some time. But it begins in the late 80s and well into the 90s with Daniel Pipes and Krauthammer to some extent, and um, and a lot of what neoconservatives were warning about. Sunnis, Shias, what's the difference? They all want to kill us, in kind of Richard Pearl's prose. Of course, as you also pointed out, kind of the conspiracy orientation of some of this. And of course, if you attack elites and you attack people in public service and you attack experts, you give rise to a sense of there is a deep state. There is conspiracy. And that's certainly how neoconservatives and Cheney saw the intelligence community in the run-up to the Iraq War. When it was leaked to the Wall Street Journal that somebody who actually works at Quincy, or not works, but is a fellow, a senior fellow, Paul Pillar, was the national intelligence officer for the Near East and South Asia from 2000 to 2005. He commissioned reports from the intelligence community, that means from the 16 different intelligence agencies at that time, that warned that if we invaded Iraq, it would be a disaster. And, that leaked. The Wall Street Journal got extremely offended by Pillar at what Pillar had done, kind of demanded his resignation or departure. He didn't leave. But it was this idea of a deep state. And Pearl had always been obsessed. This goes back to Team B, which we talked about previously, that somehow the intelligence community were a bunch of liberals, and their biases were affecting the intelligence. And that's why you had to set up an entirely different intelligence organization, which was put in the Pentagon in the run-up to the Iraq War to prove what you wanted to prove. So the politicization of intelligence is very consistent with what neoconservatives and Cheney did in the early 2000s to what we're seeing today. The great distrust of the intelligence community, which is related to experts, or anti-expert feeling. If you go way back to the beginning of the National Interest, which was a journal where neoconservatives kind of established domestic neoconservatism, a lot of that was questioning the experts and complaining about a managerial class that had emerged and how dangerous this managerial class was because it had very liberal ideas and was guided by liberal orthodoxy. This is Moynihan and Irving Howe and others were raising all kinds of questions about the direction of American society and whether it was really tied to reality, to cite Irving Kristol, and that this needed to be reformed. And this revolt against the managerial class is a theme that helps form the basis for the rise of the populist movement, the Tea Party in 2010, and then the rise of Trump in 2015, 2016. And a lot of that anti-elite worldview was fostered and propagated by neoconservatives who were, for example, attacking the foreign policy mandarins, the so-called realists, and the CIA, because the CIA, would go that is the analysts in the CIA, they'd go native, and we shouldn't take their work seriously because it's part of the managerial elite, and that creates this liberal ethos that's destroying the United States and Western civilization. These are themes from neoconservatives, ones that obviously Trump has taken a major advantage of. I think they really helped prepare the groundwork for the rise of a populist movement that would become embodied in Donald Trump and MAGA. You remember the Alaska governor who was recruited to run with McCain, which was a strategic disaster of huge...
Sarah Palin, yeah.
Sarah Palin. The person who told McCain about Sarah Palin was none other than Bill Kristol, because Sarah Palin, nobody knew who Sarah Palin was before that. And Kristol went to Alaska, I guess tipped off saying, well, there's a really talented young governor you really should get to know. And he visited with her and noticed that she had an Israeli flag on a ledge in a window in her office and was totally enamored with her and then introduced her or helped introduce her to McCain and put forward the idea of, well, she could be a great running mate, a real populist, tells it like it is, et cetera, et cetera. And that's essentially, the part of the what became the populist movement that undergirded the rise of Trump. On foreign policy, I would say the unilateralism is consistent. Cheney was definitely a unilateralist, even resisted the involvement of the UN once things seemed to go south in Iraq. He really believed that the United States should be able to act on its own, in its own, when it saw that its interests were threatened. Um, and let's see, and the neoconservative position was, well, if the other countries will simply fall in line, then it's good to have, a multilateral coalition. But the US and Israel, both of whom are morally exceptional, should be able to act unilaterally when they feel called upon to do so. Obviously, the increases in the defense budget, which is something the neocons and Cheney favored forever, is now favored by Trump. And we now have $1 trillion defense budget, which is pretty amazing, considering the lack of immediate threats. I mean, those are some of the things that I see as consistent. I of course, Trump, says this should be America first, and he comes across as being somewhat opposed to the ideas that Wolfowitz expressed back in 1992 in his defense planning guidance, the idea that the U.S. should be the ultimate guarantor of of global peace and security, and should be capable of intervening constantly, or military intervention should be a constant feature of American foreign policy in the world. That was also included in the DPG. I don't see how Trump has, except rhetorically, deviated from that very much. I mean, I think, he obviously wants to retrench or in Europe, which again, ironically, the neoconservatives were not necessarily opposed to. In fact, Irving Kristol, one of the deans of neoconservatism, one of the fathers of neoconservatism, urged that approach already in the 70s, saying that Europe had to take much more responsibility for its own defense, and if it didn't, well, the consequences would be severe. On Russia, obviously, there is a difference in that Cheney was always anti-Soviet, always anti-Russian, as were neoconservatives generally. And Trump, seems much more open to a more constructive relationship with Russia. On the other hand, if you look at it, I mean, is our current policy on the Ukraine so different from what it was a year ago? It's not, we're still in that war. And again, the idea of intervention, I mean, we're intervening all over the Caribbean basin and even on the Pacific at this point. It's unclear. It's unclear if that's very different from Wolfowitz's view, at least insofar as the hemisphere is concerned. I would say the contempt that Trump has shown for multilateral engagement, for the United Nations, for international law, is an exaggeration of the same sentiments and feelings that neoconservatives and Cheney displayed over the years. I think I think there's more consistency than Trump and MAGA would ever want to admit at this point.
Well,
Again,
or that on the other end of that, or that maybe Bill Kristol would ever want to admit.
well, yeah, precisely.
I mean,
Yeah.
I do think there are certain figures like Kristol that probably they have that little bit of liberalism still in them, so they have certain issues with Trump. But I also feel like I feel like neocons pushed a grievance politics on the base that has metastasized into MAGA now.
Oh, I think you put it much better than I did. I think that puts it very concisely, and I think that's very true. Some of them, like Brett Stevens, for example, felt very early on that Trump and the people who Trump associated with and Trump's own worldview had anti-Semitic elements and would let loose on the country uh, um, sentiments that had long been buried and considered unacceptable in public discourse. And that's why there's so many neoconservatives and became never Trumpers.
Is there anything else you'd want to add about potential continuities between, on one end, Trump and then the neoconservatives and Cheney on the other end?
Even on Israel, it's true that Trump did what Biden declined to do, which was to stop this war. But I'm not sure that there's such a big difference. I mean, in Trump's first term, Israel got virtually everything that it wanted, including moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing the Golan Heights as Israel, as part of Israel, the annexation by Israel of the Golan Heights. I mean, he went way out of his way. In the second term, I don't know that that's changed so much. He bombed Iran. That's something that Cheney desperately wanted, and the neoconservatives, especially the more hardline neoconservatives, wanted Bush to do in 2007 and 2008 before he left the White House, and pushed very hard. And that was one of Cheney's great disappointments. I mean, Cheney and Bush by the end of in 2006, Rumsfeld was basically forced to leave. Cheney was very upset by that. And then in 2007, 2008, he was urging Bush to go along with Israel's hopes at that time that the US would take out the nuclear facilities in Iran. And Bush said no, and Cheney was very, very disappointed. That disappointment, and then Bush's refusal to pardon Scooter Libby for perjury, Scooter Libby being his right-hand man, um, uh, actually, I think created a deep rift in the relationship uh, between Bush and Cheney. And indeed, by 2006, neoconservatives, with the exception of Elliott Abrams, were no longer really present in the administration. The Jacksonians and the Machtpolitikers were still there, but they weren't getting their way as nearly as much. I think Bush recognized that Iraq had been a disaster and these people were the proximate cause, or were a very important cause. So even on Israel, I don't see a great break. And, the West Bank is being annexed de facto. And it's great that Trump said, uh, we will not tolerate annexation, but I don't think that's making a great deal of difference. So, and I should also, mention that neocons, as much as they hated Trump in the first term, but they by and large, they completely agreed with what he was doing on Israel, which is for them is a central pillar of their worldview. So I don't see, except for rhetorically, and the notion that somehow the US is no longer going to be the world's policeman, I just don't see it on the ground. The Pentagon budget just keeps going up. I don't know. It's been disappointing in that respect.
In closing, I've seen a lot of slobbering op-eds about Dick Cheney since he passed away, and even people I think that should know better saying, "Well, he was a man of decorum." I mean, which surprised me. This is the guy that on the Senate floor allegedly said, "Go F yourself" to Senator Patrick Leahy.
Yeah, that's true. I remember. I mean, you just reminded me of that.
Well, it's just I think a lot of people are sort of whitewashing him, and I was wondering, what do you make of all these op-eds, and what would your final word be on how we should remember Dick Cheney?
Well, I think Dick Cheney was a warmonger. I think Cheney was seen as, and is currently being seen as, the last real Republican in a way, and kind of mainstream Republican, in that liked a really big defense budget, very pro-business, believed that the government was too powerful, at least in the economy, and should be rolled back to some extent, or to a great extent. Believed in the unitary executive, but never tried to push it as far as Trump is doing it. I think it's because of Trump that it's in comparison to Trump that Cheney is being, or the Cheney's supposed virtues are being lauded, that he's being eulogized in some way. It's because here was a very prominent and very powerful Republican member of the Republican Party whose internationalist and economic views were consistent with what they regard, what the people who are lauding him regard as having been mainstream Republicanism, and that mainstream Republicanism has lost control of the Republican Party, and that's a terrible thing. I think that's the primary reason. But Cheney, I think, wielded immense power and wielded it very poorly, and to the nation's detriment.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program.
Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I'm I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.